So this is the Godot interface. This is kind of the default setup. If you're familiar with Adobe products, you probably know that you can often kind of like change where all the windows are and stuff like that. And that's true with Godot as well. So I usually just use the default setup, but if you want, you can move stuff around. Like you can take windows out of where they are and put them other places, although it's actually not letting me do that. And you can, make these windows bigger or smaller and, reconfigure the interface. And then there's a window section where you can kind of move stuff around and do different stuff. And there's editor layouts. You can save a layout if you like it. And there's editor docs. You can see all the basic docs. So it's pretty much like any software that you've used in the past. But I typically just stick with the default layout. Normally I like to customize a layout if I'm working in like Photoshop or whatever, but I haven't really felt the need to do that with Godot. The top area has a few basic kind of settings. You can be in 2D mode, which is, for editing 2D games or UI in a 3D game. Then there's 3D mode, which is obviously for editing 3D, which we'll be doing mostly. There's a scripting view where you can write code that works with the game. And then there's an asset library where you can download plugins that you can use in the game that are usually free open source plugins. And we won't use these today, but we'll use these later. Over here, there's a bunch of buttons for previewing or building your project. We'll use these in a little bit. And then there's also a rendering mode over here. Forward plus is sort of like the higher end version of rendering. If your game seems to be running slow or the engine seems to be running slow, you could try mobile or compatibility. But if you're using one of the Classroom Macs or you have a decent laptop, then you shouldn't have an issue with this. There's a bunch of stuff up here in the Mac menus. We'll look at these at various points when we need to. The main thing we'll look at some point is the project settings, but most of the stuff we don't really need to use all that much. Let's go into 3D view. So obviously this big window in the middle is kind of like our main editing space. I'll go over this a little bit more in depth in a moment, but that's kind of like where we do most of our editing and designing. Under this is sort of contextual section where different things will open depending on what you're doing. So for example, if you're doing some animation, the animation window might pop open. If you're debugging something, the debugger console might pop open. You can also open them by clicking on them. If you're working on some shaders, that might pop open. So this will change. There's also audio. This will change depending on what you're working on. But most of the time, we'll just have this big 3D window here. Over here on the left area, there's the file system. This is just a connection to the computer file system. So if you look at, this RES stands for resource. This is kind of like the main folder of the project. If I right click here and go to open in file manager, it'll open you to the project folder on your computer. So do that in Mac or Windows. This is just so you can see the connection between the files on the computer and your project. When you have Godot open, you want to be very, very careful about moving or renaming files. So if you have a script and you want to rename it, you can do that. But if you're doing it when Godot is open, it may say, okay, you're renaming the script, I'm going to update these different things. If you don't have it open, it may not. So when you go to open it the next time, it may not be able to find stuff. This is true with like basically everything. So like when we add models, when we add scenes, be very, very careful about changing the name of a file inside the project or moving it into a different folder. So normally you want to do this in Godot. You don't want to do it in the file system. The only difference is if you're adding something that doesn't exist. If you throw something into the folder, Godot will recognize it and it'll import it. And we'll talk about that in a couple weeks, how to do that. But you really want to avoid renaming stuff and deleting stuff or moving stuff if you don't have Godot open, because it may not be able to recreate those connections when you open it again. You also want to be relatively careful about what you put in there. This default template project is, let's see, it's only 3.7 megabytes, so it's not very big. But when you're working in 3D, when you start to add models and other things like that, things tend to get pretty big pretty quickly. So you want to be careful about what you're throwing in there. If you notice that the speed, it's getting slower or the performance is getting worse, you may have some issues with some of your models or textures. But we'll talk about that in a later class when we start to add stuff in there. So right now we just have some basic stuff in here. We have some really simple default materials to use. We have a player component to throw into a scene, so you don't have to build a player from scratch. We have a script section with a bunch of different scripts that do different things that we'll discuss. There's a texture section with a few basic textures just to get started. And we'll add stuff to that. We'll talk about adding assets and different things as we go. But those are just some kind of defaults to get us started. What was your name? Isaiah? All right, so that's the file system. Above the file system is the scene editor. So this is like kind of our scene hierarchy, or sometimes it's called an outliner if you're using different 3D software. And it just shows us everything that's in the current scene that we're editing. And so we use that a lot to add new components to the scene and to edit the way the scene is set up. So if you hear me say like the scene window or the scene hierarchy, that's what I'm talking about, is this little window right here. Then over here is the inspector. This shows us properties about different components in the scene. And so we use that a lot to change different properties. I'll go over that more as we do that. So those are kind of the basics. I'm going to start to actually add some stuff into the scene and talk about the different tools and different things that we can use while we're actually doing some editing. So let's do that now. Any questions on any of the interface so far? Okay, cool. All right, so let's make a little scene and we'll talk about some of the different tools and different ways that we can edit our 3D scene. So right now you can see that our scene tab here is empty. We don't really have a scene yet. So we can create a new scene either by making a file down here, or we can just create a root node. And our root node really can be anything. If we want to make a 3D scene, we can start with a 3D node, but we can start with any other type of node and build other stuff on top of it. But one of the nice things about Godot is everything is color coded. So 2D elements are colored purple, 3D elements are colored red, and user interface elements are colored green. So we can also choose other nodes. If you click on this other node, you'll see this node this picker, and there's a ton of stuff in here. We'll look at this a bunch today. But I'm going to start my 3D scene with a 3D node. So I'm going to click on Create 3D Node. And now I have a little 3D scene. I'm going to change the name of this node, which you can do by clicking on the node and hitting Enter, and then typing a new name. Or you can right-click and go to Rename. So I'm going to hit Enter, and I'm going to call this Example. So this is just my example scene, and then I'm going to save this. And so I'm going to hit Command S, and it's going to ask me where do I want to save it. I like to keep things organized by type, so I always save all the scenes in the same folder. I save all the scripts in one folder. I save textures in one folder. I save materials in one folder. That's the way that I tend to do it. Different people do it different ways. So you might save all of the stuff for one level in one folder, but I like to save stuff by type, so that's how I'll do it. So I'll go into Scenes, and I have my Components folder in here with some specific scenes in it. We'll go over that more in a little bit. But I'm just making an example scene here. So I'm just going to save it. And so now it's saved. And if I go back and look at my, my project folder under scenes, you'll see now there's a new file, example.tscn. And tscn is just the extension for a Godot scene. So it's just a collection of properties that make up the scene. If you want to know what that looks like, you can open it in a text editor, and you'll see it's written in plain text. And there's nothing in there right now except for our main node that we just created. So we don't obviously want to edit this with text, but you can see what your scenes look like if you want to. All right, let's go back to Godot. I'm just going to quit Sublime Text. So everything in Godot is a node. Node is sort of like the basic building block. You can think of the node structure as kind of like a folder file system. Like you have your main file for your level, and then inside your level, you have like your player, you have your scenery, you have your enemies, you have your items. And so the main node kind of has everything else inside of it. And we're going to add different nodes to the scene, and we can group them together in different ways that makes it easier to edit a scene efficiently. So in 3D and in a lot of digital projects, a lot of what we're doing is just trying to come up with ways to edit things in an efficient manner, so that we don't like spend all of our time looking for some random node that we can't find anymore. So I like to keep things very, very organized. When people are first starting out, they often don't use as much organization as I do. I recommend that you try to use as much organization as you can, but eventually, if you build a big enough scene, you'll start to realize why it's important to keep things organized. Okay, so let's add something in here. So we have this example node. There's nothing really in here, and I don't want this to move either, so I'm actually just gonna go ahead and lock this node so I can't move it, because I don't really want to move the starting position of my scene. Once I do that, I'm going to add stuff in here. So if I want to add stuff to my scene, there's two ways to do it. One is with this plus button, which is add a node. You can also do Command A to do that. The other is to add another scene. You can add a scene inside of another scene. So if I wanted to add the player scene, I would use the link scene or instantiate scene. And you can do that with Command Shift A. We'll do that a little bit later. For now, I'm going to not do that. So if I want to add an object into the scene, I'm going to hit the plus sign, and then I'm going to look for the type of object that I want to use. The easiest way to find objects once you sort of get familiar with what they are is using search. So if I wanted to add a 3D mesh, I would just type in mesh, and I would get some options. If I don't know what I'm looking for, I want to see what's out there, I can just look around in this tree. So I can see I'm working on 3D, so let's see what's in my 3D section. So I have a camera, I have an audio player, I have a collision shape, I have all these different things that I can add, and they all have like different behaviors and different functionalities that they add to the scene. I'm just going to add a simple mesh. And so a mesh is sort of the most basic form of geometry that defines a 3D shape. So a mesh is made up of 3D points in space, and the game engine will draw in color or fill in between those points. So I'm going to create a mesh, and we have to notice there's nothing there right now, but now we have to use the inspector. So we made a mesh instance, but it doesn't have any geometry data in it, so it doesn't have anything to draw. We can edit the mesh, but it's not going to do very much because we don't see anything, or we're not going to know what's going on. So what I'm going to do is just make a floor for my scene. So I'm going to rename this floor. And then to make a floor, I can choose what type of geometry I think would be best for the scene. So depending on what you want the scene to look like, you might choose different things. So to choose the geometry, we go over here to the inspector. The inspector has lots and lots of stuff here, and it changes depending on what you have selected. So if I have a regular 3D node selected, there's only a couple things. There's the properties of a 3D node, which include the visibility and the transform. The transform is just the position, rotation, and scale information. And then I have the generic properties of a node, which we can add a script and do some other stuff, but we typically don't really need to use those. If I click on my floor, this is a mesh instance, so it has other properties. It still has the node 3D properties, like the transform, and the node properties, like the script, but it has new properties, including the mesh, the actual geometry data that we put in there, and it also has some other stuff in here, like some layers and some sorting. So let's add our mesh. So if I click on this empty, it's going to give me a bunch of options for different types of geometry to add. So let's add a box. So a box is just a simple type of geometry. So if I add a box, we see a box. So now we actually see something. So that's very exciting. If we want to edit the box, we can click on the mesh and a bunch of new properties appear. So when I just add the mesh, you can see, it just shows what type of mesh it is. And if I click on that mesh icon, now I have all these other properties like the size. I can add a material. There's a bunch of stuff in here. When you're editing in 3D, you're going to be tempted to change the size of your geometry by scaling your transform. Please do not do that. We don't want to scale things. Scaling takes up a lot of processor power. It's not efficient. What we want to do is change the size of the mesh, okay? So I'm going to say this probably a million times, and when you have physics errors and your program is doing all sorts of crazy stuff, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be because you went down here to scale and you did some crazy scaling, and I'm just going to click on this button and undo it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, feel free to grab more if you want. All right. So you can position and rotate, and I'll go over that in a moment, but please don't scale in the transform. If we want to resize the mesh, what we want to do is use the size properties of the original geometry. Okay, so let's do that. So let's make this look more like a floor. So notice that when we're working in 3D, we have these 3 different lines that are different colors. These are very useful for understanding what we're looking at. Red is X. That's the sort of left and right dimension. Green is Y. That's the up and down dimension. And Z is blue. That's the back and forth dimension. So obviously these are all relative to the space that we're in, but this is generally how we think about things. When you design a player, the player should be facing in the Z direction, the blue direction. When you design a scene, you're going to design outward, using X and Z, and up using Y. So if I want to make my floor wider, I want to start with X. Let's make it like 10 meters wide. So meters is obviously just like the relative unit that it's using here. So you can see now my mesh is now 10 units wide. For Y, I don't want my floor to be very tall, so I'm just going to leave it at 1. That's pretty basic. And then for Z, let's do 20 meters. Okay, so now I have like a nice floor to work with. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how to manipulate this, and then we'll probably take a break soon for you guys to play around on your own. Okay, so in the 3D editor window, in this toolbar up here, there's a bunch of options. This little arrow is sort of the default option. This is called select mode. This just means if I click on something, it'll select it. So if I don't have the floor selected and I click on it, now it's selected. This guy is the move tool. So if I click on that, now I can move the floor and I can't unselect the floor. So this is useful if you've got a lot of objects in your scene and you want to move something and you don't want to accidentally click on other objects. There's the same thing for rotate. If I toggle rotate, then I can rotate my mesh, and it won't select anything else. The last one is scale. Don't use that. Just like I was saying before, don't scale anything ever. I'm being a little bit exaggerating with the scale, but it is just something that it's when you're first getting started, it's really easy to screw up stuff by scaling things all over the place, and I really don't want you to do that. You can scale someday, but not today. Okay, so to quick access those, you can hit Q on the keyboard, and so you can use the selection tool and move stuff around or select things. If you hit W, you can just move stuff, and if you hit E, you can rotate. So all of these properties change the transform. So if I go back here and I look in my Node 3D and look at the transform, when I'm rotating, notice that these numbers change. And so I can rotate and do different stuff, and all the numbers here update. And if I change the position, the same thing happens. And if I do different stuff, all these guys rotate. If I want to reset those, anytime you see one of these little circles with the arrow, you can just reset those back to how they started. So that's useful. You can also set these directly. So if I know I want my X to be exactly 10, I can just type in 10 and set it there, or I can drag up and down. So I can kind of play with those properties either place. Another thing that's really useful up here in the editor window is, where is it? Here? Yeah, use snap. So you can see these little grid lines on the editor, and those aren't part of the actual scene. They're just visually there to help us see how big things are and what the units are. And so if I turn on snap, my mesh is going to snap to specific numbers. So you can see now it's moving at one number at a time rather than at fractions. And I can change the... here it is. I can change the snap settings under the transform menu. If I go to configure snap, I could set snap to like 10. And so now if I snap, it's going to move 10 units at a time. So this is really useful for editing with precise measurements. So I like to use snap a lot. In Godot, it's very simple. You can turn it on and off with Y, and then you can change the transform units. I wish this was a little bit easier, like there was a quick way to do this. In some editors, there's actually just a number right there that you can click on. But in Godot, you have to go to the snap settings and open it. I wonder if there's there's no key command for that. So you could probably add a key command there, but we don't need to do that. Okay, let's reset. Okay, so another thing that's very useful is you can lock an object. So this means I can't move it. So if you have a lot of stuff in your scene and you don't want to accidentally move stuff, you can lock it. You can also turn on this group selection thing. This just means that it'll select a group of objects that are together. We don't have that yet, so don't worry about that so much for right now. Okay. So let's unlock this for a second. I'm going to show you guys two quick things, and then we're going to do some workshop time. This little gizmo here, you can change the perspective, or you can go into top, bottom, or whatever view that you want. So that's useful. On the mouse, you've probably noticed that I've been zooming in and out a lot. That's just using the scroll wheel. So I can zoom in and out using the scroll wheel. It'll zoom into whatever I'm looking at. So if I take the floor and move it over here, and then hit F on the keyboard to focus, now I'm zooming in and out of wherever I'm focused. Also, F on the keyboard to focus is really, really useful. If I'm like looking over here and I hit F, then I'll just focus on whatever I'm selecting. So the zoom is really useful. F is really useful to focus. You can see that I'm rotating. I'm doing this by hitting the right mouse button on the mouse and rotating around. And this changes the camera perspective. If I if I hold down the scroll wheel as a button and rotate, it rotates around the focus point. This is called orbiting. So I'm orbiting around the focus point. If I hold the right mouse button and I use the WASD keys, I move back and forth or up and down with Q and E. And if I hold Shift, I'll zoom faster. So if I'm doing WASD just like you would in a first-person game and hold Shift, you'll move faster. So you can navigate around your scene like that. I'm just holding the right mouse button and then navigating around. If you hold spacebar, that doesn't do anything. What else? If you hold Shift, no, that doesn't do anything. If you hold Option, there's some other stuff that you can do, but I can't remember right now. But those are kind of the main things that you want to do. So yeah, that's how you kind of like move around the scene and do different edits. And then I think that's most of the stuff to do. A couple more things. We're not going to spend a lot of time in the first 3 weeks talking about materials, but if you want to change the color or basic materials of your object, you can do that. So under materials, I have like a few basic things. If I drag this material on here, you're going to see that material appear, and it's going to go into this geometry material override. For whatever reason in Godot, there's like several different places to put materials. You can also put a material on the mesh itself if you drag it right there. It doesn't really matter. If you add a bunch of materials in different places, they'll kind of add together in different ways. But you can click on this material, and if you want to change the color, you can do that. And you can do other edits. But I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with that now because it's a whole other topic. We're going to talk about that a lot in a few weeks. So you can add some basic materials. You can play around with those if you want. And then one last thing. No, actually, let's stop there. Okay. I'm going to pause there and give you guys some time to kind of play around and work with this a little bit. And then at 4, we'll take, usually we take a break from 3:40 to 4. We'll do that today. And usually I'll do like another demo at 4, and then we'll have workshop time for the rest of the class. So we'll take 20 minutes for you guys to play around. We'll take a little break. And then at 4, I'll add a couple more things in the demo and then go over how to submit your first assignment. So I'm going to stop the recording here.